In 1883, John P. Rogan was digging into Mound C at Etowah, just south of present-day Cartersville, Georgia, when the soil opened onto something that did not look like an ordinary grave. Inside the mound were stone-lined burials, human remains, and objects created with a level of craftsmanship that startled the first investigators who saw them. Then came the copper. Thin sheets had been hammered from the reverse side until human figures rose from the metal in relief. One of them showed a powerful figure caught in motion, wearing wings and falcon markings, carrying symbols of war and authority. These were not scraps of decoration. Some of the Etowah copper plates were large enough to dominate the body of the person wearing them. Smithsonian records still preserve objects collected by Rogan, and later research places the famous falcon dancer imagery in the 13th and 14th centuries. More than a century after those excavations, archaeologists can identify many of the symbols, trace artistic connections hundreds of miles away, and reconstruct parts of the society that buried them. But that first hole in Mound C opened a problem that has never completely closed. Who exactly was being represented? Why were these objects buried here? Why did the same visual language appear across such enormous distances? And why did one of the most powerful native cities in the southeast repeatedly rise, empty out, and rise again? Etowah has been excavated since the 19th century, mapped with modern sensors, studied by generations of archaeologists, and visited by thousands of people. Yet beneath the grass is still a city whose full story has never been recovered. Etowah covers roughly 54 acres beside the Etowah River. The protected site contains 6 earthen mounds, a plaza, village remains, borrow pits, and a defensive ditch. Several thousand native people lived here during portions of the period between about AD 1000 and 1550. Mound A rises roughly 63 feet, about the height of a 6-story building, and spreads across nearly 3 acres at its base. Imagine building that without dump trucks, hydraulic excavators, or steel shovels. Every load of earth had to be dug, carried, placed, and shaped by human labor. And the mounds are only the parts you can see. The harder story is underground. Modern remote sensing has shown that Etowah was filled with houses, ceremonial buildings, walls, plazas, and structures that disappeared centuries ago. Georgia describes it today as the most intact Mississippian cultural site in the southeast. What survives above ground is impressive. What survives below it is stranger. Quick second before we go deeper. If this kind of investigation is landing for you, hit subscribe. It costs 1 click, and it helps me keep doing the long research behind stories like this. Because with Etowah, the famous mounds are only the beginning. Back to it. The first discovery, the copper, came from another world of connections. When John P. Rogan excavated Mound C in the 1880s, 2 of the objects eventually known as the Rogan plates emerged from a stone box burial. One is roughly 20 inches high, the other about 16 inches. Holes in the plates suggest they could once have been suspended or attached to ceremonial clothing. The figures carry what researchers recognize as falcon imagery, forked markings around the eye, wings, weapons, and elements associated with warfare, the sky world, and elite authority. The Smithsonian dates one famous falcon dancer plate to roughly AD 1300 to 1350, but the workmanship creates a second problem. Parts of the design belong to what archaeologists call the Braden artistic tradition, strongly associated with the region around Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. Etowah lies hundreds of miles to the southeast. Somehow, An elite visual language crossed that distance. That does not mean archaeologists have discovered a mysterious lost civilization. The documented evidence points instead to wide Mississippian networks of movement, exchange, pilgrimage, diplomacy, and political symbolism. But the exact journey of the Etowah plates is still difficult to reconstruct. Were finished plates carried south from the American bottom? Were craftspeople moving between centers? Were local Etowah artists copying imported objects? Researchers can compare hammer marks, style, imagery, and metal, but there is no surviving shipping record, no written explanation, no name attached to the person who carried a plate into Georgia. The object survived, the story of its journey did not. So when you stand at Etowah today, consider the distance hidden inside that sheet of copper. How many hands did it pass through before it went underground? The second discovery. 2 stone people were waiting in a tomb. In the 1950s, Georgia State archaeologist Lewis H. Larson excavated what remained of Mound C after earlier campaigns had already cut deeply into it. Inside a wooden tomb associated with human remains, his team uncovered a pair of extraordinary stone effigies, a male and a female, each roughly 3 feet tall. Traces of paint were still visible. These were not crude blocks, they were carefully shaped human forms, created by people who had turned stone into bodies, clothing, posture, hair, identity. Picture the instant of discovery, damp mound soil coming away, a recognizable human face appearing where no face had been seen for centuries. Mississippian stone statuary is known from other places, and scholars have proposed that paired figures like these may relate to ancestors, founding lineages, fertility, leadership, or sacred genealogy. But the specific identities of the Etowah pair are gone. No inscription says who they are. No surviving Etowah text explains why they were placed with the dead. Archaeology can recover the position, material, paint, and burial context. It cannot interview the sculptor. That absence matters. These figures were important enough to carve from stone, paint, carry into a mound, and place inside a mortuary setting. What relationship did the living believe those stone people still had with the dead? The third discovery. A birdman appeared again, but this time in shell. As excavators worked through Etowah burials and deposits, they recovered carved marine shell gorgets, pendants that could be worn on the body. Some carry imagery related to the same ceremonial world seen on the copper plates. Archaeology magazine notes that Etowah shell gorgets and copper plates dating to the 13th century depict the birdman figure and were connected with high-status ceremonial display. The shell itself adds another layer. Etowah is inland. Marine shell had to move north from the Gulf region through exchange networks linking communities across the southeast. Copper came through one set of connections, marine shell came through another. At Etowah, both ended up transformed into sacred and political objects. Researchers understand much more about this imagery now than 19th century excavators did. But there is still no single translation key for Mississippian symbolism. Was the birdman an ancestor, a mythic hero, a warrior transformation, a supernatural being, a ritual role performed by living leaders, or some combination of those categories? Those possibilities are not interchangeable, and the people who made the objects would have known immediately which meaning was intended. We don't. That is the eerie thing about symbols. A picture can survive perfectly while its sentence disappears. The fourth discovery. Copper preserved something that should have vanished. In Etowah burials, metal objects sometimes created chemical conditions that slowed the destruction of nearby organic material. As archaeologists exposed copper ornaments and objects, fragments of ancient textiles survived beside them. Cloth normally disappears quickly in the humid southeast, wood rots, plant fibers collapse, color fades. But here, contact with copper preserved traces of patterned, sometimes brightly colored fabric associated with elite clothing. Suddenly, the dead at Etowah were no longer imagined only through pottery and stone. They had garments, texture, color, pattern. And this is where the evidence becomes frustrating. A surviving fragment is not a complete costume. Archaeologists can examine fibers, weaving techniques, pigments, and the position of cloth against metal, but most of the original garment is gone. No complete ceremonial robe came out of Mound C. No painted portrait survives showing exactly how the copper plates, feathered elements, shell ornaments, and textiles were worn together. Early excavations also removed materials before modern conservation standards existed, meaning information was lost at the moment of discovery. We have pieces of an elite visual system, but not the complete body wearing it. What would one Etowah leader have looked like walking into the plaza in full ceremonial dress? Archaeology can almost show us. Almost. The fifth discovery. The plaza had been deliberately painted red. In the summer of 1953, archaeologist William H. Sears cut a systematic series of test pits and trenches across Etowah. His work was less spectacular than digging into a burial mound, but it produced one of the site's strangest architectural discoveries. Beneath the modern surface, Sears found evidence that the plaza east of Mound A had been surfaced with red clay, not once, but in two major stages during the Savannah period occupation. He also found evidence of a stone wall flanking the plaza. These details were later emphasized by archaeologist Adam King, because without Sears's broad testing, researchers might never have recognized them. Imagine the effect when the surface was fresh. You are standing below a mound more than 60 feet high. Buildings rise on the summit. Hundreds of people enter an open ceremonial space, and the ground beneath them is not ordinary river-bottom soil, but an intentionally prepared red surface. That took labor. Labor means decision. Decision means meaning. Yet the precise ceremonial message of that red clay is not preserved. Was it renewed for political events, ritual purification, public games, feasting, a change of leadership? Archaeologists can date construction episodes and map surfaces, but they cannot yet recover the ceremony that made people resurface the heart of their city twice. The floor remains. The event is missing. The sixth discovery. An invisible city appeared under the grass. More than a century after Rogan, archaeologist Adam King and geophysical specialist Chester P. Walker returned to Etowah with tools the first excavators could not have imagined. Instead of opening thousands of holes, the team used instruments capable of detecting subtle changes in the ground. Measurements were taken at intervals a little over 4 inches apart, then processed into maps. And suddenly, structures that had been invisible from the surface began appearing across the site. By 2008, the team had identified about 140 buildings. Some formed dense neighborhoods around small plazas. One enormous structure approached 100 feet on a side. Think about that scale. A building almost 100 feet across is not a backyard hut. Its footprint rivals a substantial modern public building. Yet it was constructed from perishable materials such as timber, clay, and thatch. There was no steel frame, no poured concrete, no crane. Its ghost was detected centuries later because posts, trenches, fires, and disturbed earth had changed the physical properties of the soil. But discovering a building outline is not the same as knowing its function. Some structures can be interpreted from size and placement, others remain ambiguous. Residence, council house, ritual building, storage, political gathering place? The censors give archaeologists walls without voices. Etowah is still down there right now, an entire city visible only when the soil is translated into data. The seventh discovery. One of the biggest mounds still refuses to explain itself. In 1954, Roger Kelly and other investigators focused attention on Mound B, a major earthwork rising roughly 25 feet. Excavation should have clarified what such a large monument was built to do. Instead, decades later, William Sears could still describe Mound B's function as unknown. That is striking because Mississippian platform mounds often supported important buildings, residences, temples, or public structures. Archaeologists can read construction layers, post holes, ceramics, and surfaces to reconstruct sequences of use. Yet a simple label for Mound B remains difficult. This is the kind of mystery archaeology actually produces. Not a supernatural structure, not impossible technology, something more stubborn. A massive human investment whose exact purpose cannot be recovered with confidence. Thousands upon thousands of baskets of soil were carried to create it. People climbed it, rebuilt it, and organized part of their city around it. They knew exactly what it meant. Kelly dug there. Sears studied the surrounding stratigraphy. Later archaeologists revisited the old evidence. But no inscription waits at the summit saying, "This mound was for this." How can a community build something so large and leave its purpose so difficult for us to name? The eighth discovery. The city had a boundary that looks like fear. As investigators mapped Etowah's northern edge, they encountered a complex of ditches, pits, and evidence for palisade defenses. Sears noted that aerial evidence suggested the system originally extended toward the Etowah River on both sides. More striking was what happened beyond that line. Inside the defenses, occupation was intensive. Outside, Sears described virtually no archaeological evidence of native use in the tested areas. A city full of activity appears to stop sharply at its fortified boundary. Modern research has continued refining the palisade's history, and scholars connect part of its construction with Etowah's Wilbanks period political landscape. Fortifications are not mysterious by themselves. Mississippian towns faced warfare, but Etowah's defensive architecture raises a harder question. Who was the threat, and when did that threat become severe enough to justify transforming the settlement? Building a palisade means timber, organized labor, surveillance, controlled entrances, and a changed daily experience. You're no longer simply living beside a river. You're living behind a wall. Recent archaeological work argues that Etowah eventually suffered violent attack and rapid depopulation during part of its history. The burned and rebuilt landscape records conflict, but the names of the attackers and the individual decisions made during that crisis are mostly silent. The ninth discovery. Etowah disappeared before it disappeared. Sears's 1953 trenches exposed a complicated vertical sequence in which occupation layers were sometimes separated by relatively clean, sterile deposits. Later chronological work showed that Etowah was not one continuously growing city from AD 1000 to 1550. Its political history included occupation, abandonment, return, rebuilding, and changing centers of power. One reconstruction places a major gap around AD 1200 to 1250, followed by renewed occupation during the Wilbanks period. Archaeologists recognize these changes through pottery styles, stratigraphy, construction episodes, and comparison with nearby sites. That creates one of Etowah's most unsettling images. Imagine walking away from a place dominated by enormous mounds that your parents and grandparents had known. Houses empty, fires go cold, vegetation begins reclaiming plazas. Then later, another population returns, and political life gathers around the same monumental landscape. Why? Environmental pressure, warfare, political collapse, migration, competition among chiefdoms, and changing alliances all belong in the archaeological discussion. But no diary survives saying why the last family left. This is absence as evidence. No continuous occupation, no uninterrupted sequence, no written explanation. The city repeatedly stops. Tell me in the comments, what is stranger to you? The fact that Etowah became powerful, or the fact that people were willing to leave something this monumental behind? The 10th discovery. Horse bones and gun parts surfaced in a native house, then vanished. During Sears's 1953 investigation, his team excavated a structure on the eastern side of Mound B. The pottery associated with it was later re-examined by Adam King and identified with the 16th century Brewster phase. Sears reported horse bones and gun parts from that structure. That combination matters because horses and European firearms arrived in this part of the southeast during the era of Spanish expeditions. King later argued that in the 16th century context of Etowah, Hernando de Soto's expedition provides the obvious source for those materials. Then comes the problem. The horse bones and gun parts are now missing. Read that again in archaeological terms. A potentially extraordinary contact-era assemblage was excavated. It was recorded. Its context can still be discussed, but the artifacts themselves can no longer be located for renewed analysis. Modern researchers could potentially study manufacturing details, species identification, wear, corrosion, and other evidence using methods unavailable in 1953. They cannot do that if the objects are gone. There is no need to invent a cover-up. Archaeological collections from early excavations were often moved, separated, poorly catalogued, or lost. The result is disturbing enough without embellishment. Somewhere between excavation and the present, crucial physical evidence disappeared from the scientific record. Did that structure witness direct contact with Spaniards, receive traded objects second-hand, or preserve the aftermath of an encounter elsewhere? The best evidence for answering the question may no longer exist. The 11th discovery. Etowah was connected to places almost impossibly far away. The moment becomes visible not in one dramatic excavation, but when archaeologists lay objects from different sites beside one another. Copper plates from Etowah resemble materials from Cahokia and the American Bottom. Related ceremonial imagery appears at Spiro in Oklahoma, Moundville in Alabama, Lake Jackson in Florida, and other Mississippian centers. Etowah also received marine shell from the Gulf and other materials through regional exchange networks. Place those sites on a modern map, and the scale becomes obvious. This was not an isolated village living inside a Georgia river bend. It belonged to a continental world of movement. Archaeologists do not need transoceanic visitors or lost civilizations to explain that network. Native North America already contained sophisticated political, religious, and economic connections. The unresolved question is how those connections actually operated person by person. Did specialists travel? Were elite marriages linking distant centers? Did sacred objects move as diplomatic gifts? Were pilgrims carrying imagery? Did refugees bring styles after political crises? The start dates of artistic traditions can be compared. The artifacts can be chemically and stylistically analyzed. But a network this large can function in many ways. The objects prove connection more easily than they explain the relationship. That is the difference between knowing two cities were linked and knowing what one ruler said to another. The 12th discovery. The final mystery is what archaeology itself destroyed. By the time modern researchers returned to Etowah, parts of the site had already been dug again and again. Rogan worked there in the 1880s. Warren K. Moorhead excavated intensely in the 1920s. Robert Warcope dug test pits. Sears arrived in 1953. Larson and Kelly followed, with Larson's Etowah work extending over many years. Each generation learned something. Each also worked under the standards of its own time. In his later memoir, Sears complained that enormous amounts of expected documentation had never appeared. Detailed plans, stratigraphy, photographs, analyses of huge quantities of pottery and other objects. Adam King later described Etowah as famous, but for researchers trying to use its old excavation record, almost infamous, because so much work remained underpublished. Archaeology magazine reported that some excavated objects were lost or misplaced, and that portions of the site's information may be irretrievable. This is the discovery nobody wants to make. The mystery is not underground. It is in empty boxes, absent reports, missing provenience, artifacts separated from the exact place where they were found. Archaeology is destructive by nature. Once you excavate a layer, you cannot put its original relationships back together. Modern excavation compensates with mapping, photography, sampling, digital records, conservation, and increasingly with techniques that avoid digging at all. But Etowah was opened before many of those safeguards existed. No complete archive, no perfect reconstruction. Not a single future technology can analyze information that was never recorded. And that means some of Etowah's most important questions may not be waiting for a better scientist. They may be waiting for evidence that no longer exists. That is what makes Etowah different from the exaggerated version of an archaeological mystery. Nothing here requires giants, aliens, vanished advanced technology, or a hidden civilization erased from history. The documented story is more powerful than that. Native people built a monumental city beside a Georgia river. They raised a mound more than 60 feet high by moving earth without modern machinery. They created copper images tied into a symbolic world stretching hundreds of miles. They imported Gulf shell. They carved stone human figures and placed them with the dead. They resurfaced a plaza in red clay. They constructed defenses. Their city emptied, returned, changed, suffered political upheaval, and eventually entered the violent world created by European arrival. Then, centuries later, archaeologists began taking the city apart, sometimes carefully, sometimes incompletely, until modern instruments finally showed them that an even larger settlement had been beneath their feet all along. And it is still there. You can go to Etowah Indian Mounds today. You can stand beside the river, look up at Mound A, walk the protected landscape, and know that beneath the grass are post holes from vanished houses, pieces of plazas, old defensive lines, and the footprints of buildings that have not spoken for centuries. The most responsible archaeologists will tell you where the evidence is strong and where interpretation begins. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the honest edge of knowledge. Because Etowah leaves us with something every ancient city eventually does. We can recover objects, architecture, dates, food, weapons, trade routes, injuries, construction episodes, even chemical traces left in the soil. But the closer we get to the people themselves, the more we run into silence. We still want to know what they called the figures on the copper plates. We want to know why the stone man and woman were placed in that tomb. We want to know what happened when the gates closed during danger, why families abandoned the city, what ceremonies filled the Red Plaza, and what conversations brought objects hundreds of miles across the continent. The evidence has survived for roughly 7 centuries. Some of the questions may survive even longer. So when a place can reveal 140 buried buildings after more than a century of excavation, how much of Etowah is still waiting beneath the ground, visible to no one yet? Tell me what discovery stays with you the most, and share this video with someone who thinks America's deepest history begins only when written records do.